In the aftermath of the Great War, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction, history from myth, truth from legend. What is never in doubt is that in the autumn of 2281, a courier accepted a parcel that would change the course of their lives and the entire Mojave forever. This account is just one of the many that follow the courier through their journey. This is Legends of the Mojave. The road had been long and arduous. The courier had made life easier for the folks in Good Springs. He had put the powder gangers in their place. He had witnessed atrocities and banished abominations. He had become a saint to ghouls and was well liked by many in the NCR, even if it was just for getting the job done when he found paying work. He had braved the lonesome road alone and found a useful ally who had made things a bit less lonesome. Now he stood at the very gates of Vegas itself. But the road he had walked to stand upon this precipice was damn near suicide in an old vault suit with nothing to defend himself but an old varmint rifle. So he had invested his hard-earned cash and some of the not-so-hard-earned into better weapons and armor. And while he and his companion Veronica were now armed, dangerous, and not to be trifled with, it meant their pockets were empty, and these gates would be the last they would be allowed to pass through unless they could get their hands on a decent chunk of change somewhere. This was fine by him. Benny had reached Vegas long ago, and given the frippery that seemed to imbue his very being and everything he touched, from that immaculate plaid jacket to the embossing on the gun that now haunted the courier's dreams. Yes, Benny likely had the funds to gain entry to the strip proper, and wasn't likely to come back out again anytime soon. So the courier had time, and if his travels had taught him anything, it's that there's always someone with odd jobs that need doing. It was time to stop dawdling. The courier shoved at the heavy gates, and as they grudgingly gave way, entered Freeside. The courier stopped to process the scene that now assaulted his senses. This was Vegas? On one side of the street, a beggar, downtrodden and unable or unwilling to provide for himself. On the other, a shady character obviously up to no good, either a dealer and not the kind with cards, or perhaps just looking for an easy mark to wander into town that could be held up. Children chased rats down the street, knives in hand. I guess their mothers never told them not to run with sharp objects, if these kids even had a mother. Piles of garbage, rubble, and who knows what else adorned the streets, and the smell suggested that there wasn't much in the way of working plumbing in this section of the city. This place gave squalor a bad name. Freeside was the gauntlet that had to be run before you could get to the strip. Beggars, robbers, hookers, dealers, and even just honest working vendors who couldn't afford to trade inside the strip were all trying their best to get their hands on the caps that travelers toted into town, as they hoped to strike it rich on the strip. Finding paying work here wouldn't be as easy as the courier had hoped. This place would test his resolve and integrity in ways that he had yet to face. As he and Veronica explored Freeside, a man in a nearby alley began frantically beckoning to them. The courier glanced at his companion and she nodded back. This wasn't the first time the courier had been asked to help a stranger in a dangerous area only to be lured into a trap. They could have easily just kept walking, but the courier had grown to despise those who preyed on the weak, or in this place the suicidally stupid. Either way, if it really was someone in distress, they might be able to help, and if not, well, Veronica had been calibrating her power fist ever since they left Quarry Junction and was itching to try it out. Sure enough, as soon as they reached the man in the back of the alley, it was clear this was an ambush, mostly because the idiot told them it was. Not the brightest group of thieves and murderers in the world. It was over quicker than a mini-nuke detonation. 3 less killers roaming the streets, 3 more rotting piles of meat to add to the stench of Freeside. It was clear these streets were more dangerous at night, so it was time to either catch a wink or find some business establishment that was open after dark. The alley they were in was probably the most defensible spot they could ask for, but the courier wasn't about to curl up next to the bodies they had just corpseified, and whatever that puddle was behind those dumpsters. So they went back the way they had come and entered Mick and Ralph's, the closest thing Freeside had to a general store. The courier used a bit of his charm to learn that Ralph was a skilled forger who could write a phony passport to get them onto the strip. He even negotiated a discount, but the cost was still too steep for his liking, so for the time being, they parted ways with Ralph and decided to hit up Mick, who ran the weapons side of the store. Even for a place as impoverished as Freeside, the courier was a bit confused by the shoddy selection Mick had, and correctly deduced that he was holding back his special stock for the customers whom the casinos hadn't yet broke. He got Mick to show him the good stuff, and actually had some impressive items, but nothing the courier couldn't live without, or afford for that matter. By now the sun was coming up and it was now safe to return to the streets, or at least as safe as you could hope for in Freeside. As they walked, interrupted only by the occasional comedy act of a child chasing a rat, they passed the old Mormon fort. Originally constructed by some pre-war religious group, this place once served as a way station and garrison to protect shipments of rare materials coming from California to a place called Utah in the east. What stood here was an attempt by pre-war governments to approximate the original fort, but brick and stone are brick and stone, and this place made for a safe haven in the midst of lawless Freeside. The flag flying over the fort showed that it was currently held by the followers of the apocalypse. The courier's thoughts returned to Ignacio Rivas, the man at Helios 1 working to prevent the NCR from discovering Archimedes and trying to make life easier for the people that desperately needed it living out in the desert. The courier was relieved to think such a fortification was held by a group that hopefully shared many of Ignacio's values, rather than some despot lording over the miserable people of Freeside. Although he wasn't too sure, he was confident in their ability to actually protect it if anyone did show up with the intent of taking the fort for themselves. For now, the courier simply made a mental note and decided to keep checking out Freeside. At one end of town was a water fountain with some greaser standing guard. Apparently nothing in Vegas is free, especially not clean drinking water. Bottled or even by the sip, if you wanted water, you had to pay by order of the king. Supposedly it was a means of regulating usage as the NCR controlled water distribution, and if there was too much of a demand on the Freeside pumps, the NCR was likely to shut it down completely. The courier wasn't so sure he bought that excuse, and even if it were true and the NCR really would sacrifice Freeside if it meant keeping their troops over at McCarran alive, the courier could think of far more humane methods of regulating water usage than cutting off access to the city's most desperate. By the time the sun began to dip once more, the courier had still failed to find any paying work, so now with darkness falling, he decided to check out the fort. Inside the courtyard was a sandbag bunker and several armed guards. If the old adage was true, at least the people here would be polite. Beside the mercs, there were several people wearing lab coats, possibly doctors. Surrounding the perimeter were military-style tents like the ones used by the NCR, filled with sick and injured, detoxing junkies, people who had been beaten, robbed, and left for dead in the streets, and those who simply couldn't afford a drink at the pumps and collapsed of dehydration were just a sample of those who eventually ended up under the care of the followers. A bastion of humanitarianism in the midst of selfish indifference and greed. Still, even in this place, there were no job offers, no wrongs needing righted. The courier couldn't believe his rotten luck. Suddenly, all of the tales of people who had come to Vegas to make their fortune and found only ruin were starting to make a lot more sense. There were plenty of opportunities to lose your money before you even reached the strip, even in a place deceptively named Freeside. However, there weren't a whole lot of options to earn any of it back. After striking up a conversation with a ghoul cowgirl, he had learned that the twins that ran the Atomic Wrangler Casino might have some work for him. Finally, a lead on some caps. He had hoped to spend the night inside the safety of the Mormon fort, but surrounded by all the sick and wounded, not to mention hired guns that didn't have any particular loyalty to him, he thought better of the notion, and decided to risk heading deeper into Freeside at night to see if one of the twins was still awake and possibly in a hiring mood. They stepped through the gates that separated Freeside's main drag from the outskirts. On his left was the king's headquarters, a surprisingly well-preserved structure guarded by more greasers. Apparently, the kings had some semblance of a uniform, so at least they would be easy to spot from a distance. With what little he knew of the king, a man who would charge you a night's stay in a flophouse for just a mouthful of water, the courier was convinced that even if there was work to be had from the king, he probably wasn't going to like the type of work he'd be expected to do, and any payment would likely be meager at best. So he instead turned right down Freeside's old strip, a gauntlet of barkers, rubble, and the refuse of debauchery, well lit by what appeared to be the only abundance of electricity in Freeside. They sidled up to the Atomic Wrangler, the only casino, entertainment venue, whorehouse, and drinking establishment in Freeside, all wrapped into one. The interior wasn't so dissimilar to the Vicky and Vance back in Prim. It had all the amenities a person with more money than sense could ask for, only dingier than one might prefer. By Freeside standards, though, this was a veritable habitable palace, and the guards posted up throughout the Wrangler sent a clear message that this place was not where you would want to act out. He thought about posting up at the blackjack table to try his luck as he had done at the Vicky and Vance, but thought better of the idea until he had a bit more of a buffer in his purse. So instead he approached the bar, where Francine Garrett, one of the twins who owned the Wrangler, was tending. Turns out the rumors were true. Francine did have paying work for the Courier, shaking down deadbeats who had skipped out on their tabs. It wasn't the most glorious work, and it certainly dipped a bit deeper into the moral grays than he'd like, but this was the first paying work that he had found since he had entered Freeside. He was a bit relieved that the Garretts didn't want any killing done, even if it was just because it's harder to collect caps from a corpse. He was offered 25% if he could collect everything that was owed, but he was able to negotiate a 50-50 split if he could collect everything, a deal he would later come to despise. His work for Frankie would take him to the main entrance to the Strip, a shining beacon from afar beckoning fools to rush in, but from up close, a fortified killing zone protected by several H&H Tool Company Securitrons. The Courier had wondered if Victor had been among them if he could allow entry, but something told him he would just act friendly, tell him nothing, and skedaddle without offering any real help anyway. He struck up a conversation with old Ben, a colorful, congenial individual who seemed severely out of place in Freeside, but he seemed content to just post up at the main gate to the Strip, warn people away from the Securitrons, and engage in friendly conversation with travelers. The Courier eventually bid his farewell as nearby he spotted one of his targets, Lady Jane. She switched from polite and cordial to rude and arrogant in an instant, which made it easy to justify the crass language necessary for a paid thug to collect on a debt. As you would expect, she initially claimed not to have the caps to pay her debt, and even tried to send the Courier off to some cave on an obvious suicide mission to recover her lost caravan's cash box. Not likely. The Courier took the caps she had on her and some trinkets with decent trade value and sent her on her way. Next on the list was Santiago, a man who fancied himself a silver-tongued devil who tried, rather transparently, to steer their conversation away from money at every turn and claimed he had already paid his debt to the Garretts. A little embellished threat about a bounty on his head was enough to loosen Santiago's billfold. Last on the list was Grex, the most lopsided ghoul you had ever seen. He must have been one ugly fellow even before he was ghoulified. He was jumpy and obviously terrified of the well-armed enforcers sent after him, and he easily buckled. The Courier had to coerce a bit more out of him to get the whole amount he owed, and had considered adding a bit of humiliation to the wishy-washy, lopsy-sided ghoul, making him give up the clothes off his back, but instead opted to simply draw the line at letting him off with an empty death threat if he ever tried to skip out on the Garretts again. Frankie Garrett was grateful and held up her end of the deal. 300 caps payment for 600 caps collected. A nice start, but far from the 2,000 caps he'd need to pass the credit check at the Strip gate. Next job she had offered the Courier was to make an example of their former enforcer, a man named McCafferty. He had apparently taken issue with his work being outsourced to the Courier and had stolen from the twins and absconded to the Strip. The Garretts wanted McCafferty dead, so much for not squeezing debts from a corpse. The Courier accepted. To gain access to the Strip, Francine told him to seek out the king, who might be able to work out some sort of deal to get him onto the Strip. The Courier stepped away from his meeting with Francine and felt disgusted with himself. At the first mention of caps, he had gladly shaken down strangers and taken everything of value they had, reduced them to the lowest dregs of Freeside society, if such a term even held any meaning. He had even added insult to injury by reminding them that the Garretts weren't to be crossed, as if that was a lesson he hadn't already taught with cruel efficiency. Now here he was, taking kill contracts on someone who had never done him any wrong. Was this what Vegas did to people? Ground away at their integrity, their scruples, their morals, until there was nothing left but greed and violence? Was he really that different from Benny at this point? At least for now, he had an excuse not to move forward with his current job assignment. He didn't have access to the Strip, so for now he could see if there was any other work to be done. Maybe he wouldn't have to deal with the king at all. Maybe he could scrape enough money together that he could pass the credit check at the gates and gain entry on his own merit. Merit. A word that had no meaning in a place like this. As he was preparing to leave, the Courier ran into James Garrett, the other twin. James ran the brothel side of the business. Seems the Garretts were having trouble slinging the kind of meat their wealthier clients had a taste for. Not literally, mind you, I hope. Anyway, the Courier was able to get a finder's fee if he could recruit a smooth-talking man, a cowboy ghoul, and let's say the client really liked robots. After haggling over his fee, the Courier set out in search of hospitable companions of the night. He was especially happy to pursue this job because it didn't involve any killing, but what also made it better was he already knew exactly where to find two folks who could be convinced to sign on right here in Freeside. He first approached Old Ben, who had actually had a bit of experience as an escort in the past. He took a bit of convincing, but eventually agreed to sign on. His next recruit was waiting at the old Mormon fort. One of the mercs guarding the fort was a she-ghoul fond of western wear, leather straps, don't ask, and a stiff drink after a long shift, which she was sadly denied by her current employer due to the number of detoxing alcoholics and junkies receiving treatment at the fort. All it took to get her to sign on with the Garretts was promising her free drinks and the freedom to get rough with the customers now and then. Yikes. The last job, a pleasure bot, was far more complicated. The Courier figured the only shop that would have any idea about robots on this side of the strip would be Mick and Ralph's, so he decided to head that way. En route, he spotted a couple kids playing with what looked like a toy laser gun from a distance, but when he got closer, he noticed it was actually pretty sturdy construction, sort of the same materials as pre-war laser or plasma weapons. Then he saw it, the unmistakable logo for Poseidon Energy, the company that owned and operated Helios 1 and the Archimedes superweapon that could be made operational simply by redirecting power back to Helios 1, but for the absence of a mysterious handheld targeting system. These kids had no idea how lucky they were that the Courier had chosen not to activate Archimedes. Them and the rest of Freeside, though the Courier figured it wouldn't make much of a difference on the state of this place if it did take a couple hits from the weapon. The Courier convinced the kid to let the gun go for 20 caps and breathed easy. At least now the targeting system was in safe hands. Even if that idiot Fantastic did muck things up and direct power back to the weapon, it would still be of no use to anyone without this targeting system. Crisis averted, he continued to Mick and Ralph's. Ralph did happen to know where just such a specialized robot could be found in an old electronics repair shop in a secluded area of Freeside. It would need a control module, but Ralph could fashion him one for a price. The Courier accepted, and once the part was ready, headed out to find the robot. The shop wasn't anything too dangerous, a minor rat infestation. The workbenches were littered with valuable components as well, so the Courier filled his pockets. Even if he had unpaid expenses on this job, he could probably recoup some of his losses by selling off sensor modules and fission batteries. In the back, patiently waiting in its charging pod, was a Protectron. The Courier input Ralph's control disk into the terminal connected to the pod, and Fisto clanked forward, ready to serve. The Courier was a bit curious what would drive someone to be so interested in such a companion, but when it requested that he assume the position, he couldn't bring himself to oblige. That and Veronica would probably never look at him the same way ever again, so he just declined services and brought Fisto to its new home at the Wrangler. There was an incident when the group left the shop and were set upon by three little old ladies, but these gals were anything but golden and were dead set on drawing blood. Like the many muggers and thugs they had encountered since they reached Freeside, the mods were no match for the Courier and his companion, and the Courier was just glad Fisto wasn't damaged in the altercation. James Garrett was so giddy and excited, the Courier got the distinct impression that he was actually the wealthy client that had requested Fisto. He even caved easily when the Courier negotiated for a higher finder's fee. Garrett was a little disappointed that Beatrix was a she-ghoul and not a he-ghoul, but was convinced the customer would still be happy enough with the arrangement. He was also satisfied with Old Ben as the smooth-talking ladies' man, whom apparently had already developed quite a reputation that had preceded him. The Courier was satisfied that he had completed another job for Freeside's more notable citizens. Hopefully his reputation would open the door to more paying work around town. Hopefully work that made him feel a little less dirty. But for now, the only other work he had lined up was the price on McCafferty's head, that little corner he had inadvertently painted himself into. He had ingratiated himself to the Garretts, but would they be so understanding if he started leaving jobs unfinished, letting people who slighted them get away? That didn't seem to be part of their repertoire. The Courier needed to take his mind off his current task, so he headed over to the cashier's window and exchanged some Legion denarii that he had collected in his travels. Those kooks actually used metal coins for currency, and the Courier was thankful to lighten his his pack by exchanging them for chips. Just as he had done in Prim, he posted up at a blackjack table and whiled away for what had to have been hours, possibly even days. Just as with the Vicky and Vance, every once in a while the casino would present gifts on behalf of the Atomic Wrangler to keep gamblers invested and ready to stake a bit too much for a bit too long. Of course, the Garretts weren't nearly as desperate to attract gamblers as the Vicky and Vance was, Freeside being a necessary stop on the way to the Strip, and as such their gifts weren't nearly as valuable as those at the Vicky and Vance, and were geared entirely toward adding to gamblers' inebriation and delusions of standing. Alcohol or fancy clothes, not a stealth boy or sturdy leather armor, or anything else that might keep you alive out in the desert. Of course, the Garretts were swimming in caps, so it took quite a bit longer before the Courier once again found himself cut off, banned from gambling at the casino. 5,000 caps now weighed down his purse, more than enough to get him onto the Strip. But did he even want that anymore? This place was changing him, and not for the better. Anyone could see that, even the Courier. Throughout the Mojave, he had built a reputation on being a reliable bringer of safety, stability, and from time to time brought swift justice to those who deserved it. But ever since he had come to Freeside, he had done nothing but act in self-interest at others' expense, haggling for the lowest prices and the highest payouts. He gambled. He turned people toward a life of prostitution when they otherwise would have likely never even considered it. He even took a robot that could have been programmed to police the dangerous streets of Freeside and turned it into a tawdry abomination. He had forced people to give up every cap they had to the Garretts, threatened them, and even though every life he had taken had deserved what came to them, the body count was mounting and was beginning to weigh heavy on his conscience. This place had seeped into his soul like Cazador venom and poisoned his very character. As he stood in the middle of the street, behind him the Atomic Wrangler and the Silver Rush, headquarters for the Van Graff's weapon merchants, to his right the entryway to the Strip, and directly ahead the King's School for Impersonation, home of the King himself, Freeside's unofficial ruler. The Courier wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish. What would confronting the King possibly do to regain any of the honor he had willingly cast aside? It didn't matter. One way or another, he was not going to enter the Strip as Freeside's bringer of death, destitution, and debauchery. If he was finally going to confront Benny, it was going to be with at least one good deed fresh in his mind. It was time to pay a visit to the King's court.